Hi, Julie Usher, welcome back. In my last video, I showed you how to make a 3D wedding cake using the sandwiching technique. In this video, we're taking it up a level because we're going to actually mount it on a cookie pedestal. So we're talking about how to assemble these cookie pedestals. Again, we're going to put our 2D, now 3D wedding cake on it, but they can also be really cute ways of displaying other sweets. I've got little lemon meringue tarts on these in the foreground. So we'll start, again, this is largely an assembly video. We'll start by talking about the pieces that are needed, and then we'll move from there. So what you'll need is a base for the pedestal. I've got daisies on those. I've got a standard fluted round from the Atico set. It's about 3 inches across that I'm going to be using to put this cake up on. You'll need the top of the cake stand. An oval is what my cake is mounted on, but you can really go with any shape. Like this fluted cutter is really quite pretty, and that could make a smaller little cake stand and be quite nice. So feel free to get creative. And then you'll need at least 5 or 6 round cookies. These are 1 inch to 1 1/4 inches with a hole cut in the center. And I cut the hole in the center with a 1/4 inch pastry tip before baking. These are going to form the stem of the pedestal. So let's get started with putting the stem together because it requires some drying time. And I'm seated particularly low in this video because this is going to be put together and stand tall, and I need to see that it's level as I assemble it. So I'd like to be at eye level for this one, as close to as possible. So for making this pedestal, I think it's easiest to do it by taking a lollipop stick and just mounting it into a piece of styrofoam. And I've got a little piece of parchment paper here because we're going to be gluing these little discs together to create the stem. And this way I'm not going to glue it to the styrofoam. It'll be easy to come off later if I have parchment paper down there. I can just peel that off. And I'm going to go ahead and stack these together. As I said, these tend to look best when these are at least 5 or 6 high, or higher, depending on the size of the cake stand. Whoops, I didn't want to glue that one. I don't want to glue the bottom one to the paper. I just want to slip one down. Got glue on the back side of that one. I'm also gluing to some extent in the inside here. And as I'm gluing, I'm also making sure that the pieces are fairly lined up with one another. So there isn't one that's like sitting way off to the side. Like that doesn't look great. So I'd want to make sure it's positioned as close to center as it can be. If it's not perfect, we're going to be doing some filing of this piece before we actually cover the stem. The stems on these are all covered, so you don't actually see the gingerbread or the sugar cookie underneath. You could work with sugar cookies on here too. So I've got that all glued together. I'd wait for this to dry before I trim down the lollipop sticks. This is the same process I use for making the handles on my wedding bouquets, by the way, in which case I like to have the stick sometimes to go through the piece on top. We're not going to have this sticking through to the cake stand here because it's already mounted, so I am going to have to trim this down. It's easier to do it once it's dry, otherwise I'm going to move this all around. Same thing, I trim the bottom piece off. So for now, let's let it dry, and I'll show you one that's already been trimmed and filed that's ready to wrap. This is dried at least half an hour before I can handle it like so. The other thing I've done with this is I've actually filed it down. So there were some that were a little bit narrower than others. I wanted to get the sides as straight as possible. So once it was dry, I just ran it over my grater. If you're not going to eat this, you could use sanding paper, but since we're eating this, run it over a grater or a fine microplaner and just get the sides all nice and uniform. Brush off any extra crumb because it's just going to get in the way. And we're going to wrap this with a frosting sheet so we cover up the gingerbread. But the first thing I want to do before wrapping it is actually clean this work surface off and fill in some of those holes with a little bit of white icing. Again, that'll just make it wrap more smoothly if you don't have those little edges there. So let me get some thick white icing to do that with, and we'll get that filled. So I've got my thick glue in a parchment cone, and I'm just going to fill in some of these holes with the cone. You can also just smear it on with an offset spatula. This does not have to be neat. And in fact, I'm going to open this up a little bit more and just do this more efficiently. Just cover it, and I'll come around with an offset spatula and just smooth that out. And what I'm trying to do here is fill these holes, because I'm going to be wrapping this frosting sheet around it, and it'll just appear less lumpy if they're full. There, so I've got a nicely prepped pedestal stand waiting to be wrapped, and I don't really have to wait here for that white icing to dry, because that'll actually help to stick the frosting sheet down onto it. Now, I measured the height of this with my ruler, and it is, let's just verify, it's about 1 5/8 inches tall. So I pre-cut some frosting sheets to wrap that with. I've got 2. You could just wrap it with a plain white frosting sheet, but you'll see a little bit of the dark dough behind it. Plus it's kind of boring. So I'm going to wrap it with 2 sheets, a plain frosting sheet and one that has this bit of this pattern on it. Now to do that, I just want to adhere them with a little bit of corn syrup to one another. Let me move all this stuff out of the way. I've taken the backing papers off, and until that time I had them stored pre-cut in a plastic baggie, because if they are exposed to air, they will dry out. So I just want to make this tacky with corn syrup. I don't want to make it wet with corn syrup, because then you'll see through, the corn syrup will bleed through into that upper paper and leave spots. I won't need this full length. I only need enough to get around. And what I might do, just to be on the safe side, is just blot off a little bit of the extra corn syrup. And then this, I'm going to get up a little bit higher to do, because I want to place it right on top. And then put the 2 together. And we're going to apply corn syrup to the back just to glue it up on this stand. And I'm using a sponge brush for this task. I find I tend to get less on the paper this way than with a regular bristle brush, and the bristles don't get stuck in the corn syrup. Okay, I think I should have it amply tacky to go all the way around. And I'm just going to wrap it around. I'm not going to press it too much into the side, because I don't want any lumpiness there is on the side of the pedestal. I will only be accentuated if I really press into the sides. I'm just going to press it enough so it sticks down, and then we'll cut there's going to be seam in the back. Can't really avoid that. Just try to cut it straight. Right now I'm wrapping it to see where they intersect. I could have cut this paper shorter in advance and saved some, which is always a good idea, but not a necessity. And if it's not fitting flush against the top here, as long as it's stuck to the bottom, that's okay. You're not going to see that little gap there, because the cake stand's going to be sitting on top of it. Just want to make sure it's secured in the back. So the only area I really press hard on is in the back, just to make sure it's really put together. Okay, now we're ready to mount that on what's going to be the base of the stand. And here I'm going to revert back to my non-skid surface, just because I don't want this to move around. I stenciled the base. You could do whatever you wanted. You could leave it plain. I liked it. But whatever you do, you don't want too much in the middle, because you want this sitting flush on the surface. And in fact, these big blue dots that I put down earlier are kind of interfering with that. So I'm going to see if I can snap them off and get that to lie a little bit closer. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay, now we're ready to start gluing. Again, it's an assembly process. So I use a thick icing glue. I could have used white here in case any brown peeks out. You want to make sure it's centered too. This is why it's a good idea to use probably white. Eventually the frosting sheet will dry till it's brittle. You could break it if it's dry if you press into the sides. So you got to be careful. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And now we're ready to mount the cake on top. You know, you could just go ahead and mount plain piece on top with a little bit of glue and you're done. But we've got a big cake, which is going to make it slightly more challenging. But you do want to get the cake up on the top piece first before putting it on this pedestal, because it's much harder to mount the cake in 3D up on top of something that's like this, that's elevated. And I'm going to pick this up, not from the needle point of this, and try to make sure it's centered from the side as well as from, from the side. I'm looking at it from the side now, as well as from the front. How's that looking from the side? I think I can come a little bit further forward. You want to do all your adjustments while the glue is still wet. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to adjust. But I think that looks pretty darn good. Now, I'm going to let this sit, and it's pretty level. Again, I'm looking at it from all directions. I'm going to let this dry for 30 minutes. I'm going to come back and I'm going to put some little eyelet lace cut out of a frosting sheet at the bottom. But I don't want to do this right now because it's still kind of in a precarious spot. It's still moving a little bit, and I want this base to be pretty firmly in place. So I'll break, and I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, so it's dried 30 minutes. I'm ready to put the eyelet lace on. And again, I'm working with a frosting sheet for this because it's going to be nice and pliable and bend all the way around. And to get that pretty eyelet pattern, I'm using a fun craft paper punch. I believe this is a Martha Stewart one that cuts in a big long line if you properly align it. I've got some pre-cut. I'm just going to show you how you match it up. I start by cutting a really clean, sharp edge on a paper cutter on one end, and then we'll push down. I need to do this standing up so I can get enough leverage on the craft punch. And then you want to shift it forward once you punch until this cut piece lines up with the end here. There's a little marking and there's a little guide here. Match it up and then make sure that's fitting along the guide here as well. Punch again, and then this piece coming out should line up down there, and so on, and you just continue down the line. I'm going to need 2 full pieces cut the full length, which is about 10 inches of the frosting sheet to get all the way around. And then I'd go back to my paper cutter or take scissors and cut another clean straight edge along here to create the piece of lace that we're going to then fix up to the side of the cake stand, like so. But I've got longer strips cut. But that's the process of using those punches. So, get creative because there are so many different punches out there and so many possibilities. So I've got 2 pre-cut strips that I kept under wraps in the plastic container until I was ready to apply them. And I'm going to apply the front piece first. And again, I'm going to do that with a little bit of corn syrup to the back side. And I certainly don't want too much here because there'll be spotting. So what I'm going to do is blot it on my paper towel first, my sponge brush, and just do a little bit along the upper edge. I'm working on a piece of parchment paper here so I don't get my work surface all tacky. I broke a little bit of the edge there. I'll try to cover that with some, actually I'll try to put that closer to the side. I'll try to cover that with some dots later. You don't need much for it to stick, but you do have to hold it up because this is a long piece until it's stuck. This is where it helps to be eye level because I'm trying to make sure it's going down, it's going down nice and straight. So I did crack the frosting sheet there a little bit and picking it up, and I'm going to come in with some white dots to finish this off so I can hopefully cover that. What I want to do at this point is tack down this end, which is before it pulls the rest of it off. And then we'll apply the lace also to the back side. But I'm trying to wrap this at least halfway around, if not more, so my seams are in the back. Cut a straight edge back here. Careful moving this around. At this point, you can also apply directly to the cake stand too. A little bit. That's sometimes easier than getting it on the paper. Okay. So here's how it looks from the front. Very, very cute. And I would just repeat the same process on the back side with another strip. Okay, so I've got the frosting sheet eyelet lace on the front of it, and I also went ahead and I put it on the back. I just cut a slightly smaller piece, so my seams are in the back. So this will always view nicely from the front. And I don't particularly like that crack or necessarily the gingerbread showing there, so I'm going to come back in with icing of beadwork consistency to kind of fill those holes. I'm going to start here because I want to size my beads to nicely cover where I cracked the frosting sheet. If I was really picky, I could come back in and replace that frosting sheet, but I think it's going to nicely conceal it. And we'll go all the way around. I think this just kind of finishes off the edge quite nicely. We'll do the front. And of course, this process would be a little bit easier if I didn't have the cake already mounted on the top. You can just do these plain and put other cookies on them, desserts, or what have you. I would recommend, though, if you're putting a dessert on top of the cookie sheet, on top of the cookie pedestal, a real dessert like those lemon meringue tarts, that you put it in a cupcake liner first, because some of the oils and moisture from that tart can seep through and discolor the icing on top of the cookie. And if you wanted to use the cookie stand again and not eat it, you wouldn't want that to happen. So I'm just finishing up with dots. And in the next video, I'll show a variation of this sort of pedestal technique. I'm going to be making a stem for a 3D wedding bouquet, which uses that same construction. Till then, live sweetly.